reason that I wanted to kind of organize this discussion is I found myself becoming involved in political activism as a college student, like a lot of us. I was president of our campus's LGBT organization and active in Hillel, and I saw those things as kind of intrinsically separate. And I didn't understand how these two identities could necessarily be merged, but as I entered graduate school, I noticed that it was sort of a trend for a lot of younger American Jews to fuse Jewish practice specifically and activism. So I kind of wanted to explore what that means for others, and also to get some different perspectives from different industries, different areas of the country, so that's why I invited you guys here today. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, giving us your name, maybe where you work, where you're from, and maybe some of your first memories of becoming involved with activism, how you're involved politically now, anything to get us started. David, do you want to?
Sorry, trying to find
Me
a pen.
first?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to let you go first. Sure. My name's David Lloyd Olson. I grew up in Atlanta, or the suburbs of Atlanta. I went to a pretty conservative, Republican. We can talk about what that means. Family, but then came to the University of Maryland College Park and have been in the area for 10 years. We've already determined I'm the oldest of the millennial spectrum represented on the panel. So when I first got to Washington, D.C., the first thing I did was, or the metro area, was a protest against the war in Iraq because Bush was president, and that was like the middle of the activist community. And then, of course, we had the Obama administration. So anyway, I work in theater, though. I'm a professional theater artist, and I currently work at the Shakespeare Theater Company and have a company called Pointless Theater that creates original puppet spectacles. So we use art and spectacle to create conversations with communities, whether that's with classic texts or with new work, examining the issues of our day through a lens of fictional characters and sometimes pushing the boundaries of that. And we also work with communities, really working with youth to give them a voice, to give them a platform in which to express themselves and their ideas about how the world should be, through theater, through writing or devising plays and new works. So that's the beginning of knowing about me.
I'm Dylan Morpurgo. I grew up in Philadelphia. My political background kind of started when I was in high school. I worked on the Hillary Clinton 2008 campaign. That was kind of my introduction to like field organizing, activism. From there, I worked on a lot of issue advocacy campaigns in the queer rights movement, women's rights movement. I was legislative aide state government in Pennsylvania, where I was from. But now I actually work a little differently. I do similar field organizing, but in the Jewish community. I work for Hillel International, specifically for the David Project, which is a Israel-focused organization working on college campuses with students, connecting Jewish communities to non-Jewish communities. It's actually how I know Steph. And our work is focused on bridging these activist communities together, finding common ground. So kind of bridging these different political, Israel, Jewish activist spaces all together there. Yeah.
I'm Steph Black. I am originally from the Boston area, but very happily living in DC and for the near future at the very least. I am only 22, feel very old right now because I'm a senior in college at American University, but soon to feel very young when I have to graduate. My first ever protest, I was the March for Life, actually, way back when. It happens every year, but it was like my first March for Life in January. I was almost arrested after not vacating the front of the march and preventing them from marching. I was arrested for the first time in an act of civil disobedience just a couple weeks ago on the first day of Kavanaugh's hearings. My progression of activism has come full circle, it feels. I'm very much an activist. I'm very active in my activism. I'm a women's studies major, if you couldn't tell. Everything about me doesn't say that. You'll figure that out pretty soon. And I hope to continue this. I recognize that I'm very lucky to be in college and have the freedom to be loud and all over DC and a rabble rouser, and there's privilege in being able to be all of those things. I don't know what it's going to look like when I actually have to get a job. I hope to continue this somehow, some way, but to be determined. TBD. I have good role models. So
Well, I heard on Fox News that they're hiring protesters. That's like by the thousands and paying them. So I think you're.
I got my check the other day. Yeah, it was really great. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for that introduction. And speaking of identity, it's good that you should bring that up. I'm sure that in any religious or cultural community, there's discussion surrounding generational differences. But I'm curious, how, if at all, is your Judaism different from your parents' or your grandparents' Judaism? How is your involvement different? Does it look any different at all?
Well, I'll answer. That's a little easier for me to answer. My parents and my grandparents aren't Jewish. I converted. My dad's family, we have a really strong Jewish history, but him and his siblings, they were raised Christian background. My parents don't have really any faith practice or background of any kind. But so my Jewish practice is very different from theirs, and that they don't have one. So a little easier to answer. Maybe you guys could shed a little more light on that.
Actually, very similarly. My mother is Jewish, and my grandmother is Jewish, and so forth. My dad is Christian, but neither of them really have any sort of strong faith background. I was raised very secularly, where Jewish meant matzo balls and bagels. And I very deliberately decided that I wanted to be Jewish when I was 19. Way back when, all of 3 years ago. And my evolution of like my activism has developed very hand in hand with my, which one did I say? My activism developed with my Judaism. I forget which one I said first, but.
Would you say simultaneously?
Yeah, 100%. So they're constitutive of each other in a lot of ways, which I will get more into later, but.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm also from a mixed marriage. How
Hey.
interesting. My mother Jewish, my father not, but I was raised like totally like Hebrew school going, like synagogue attending, conservative Judaism. We even were on the more like conservadox side of conservative Judaism. Though my mother was like a super feminist when it comes to Jewish ritual, she also like always covered her head in shul. So, but like. So my Jewish practice is actually very similar to my mother's and her side of the family because I belong here at Addis, and I feel like it's very similar. You saw from when I grew up, like practicing, though the political values of this congregation are different, and I think that actually does have a huge effect on the practice of Judaism, especially as it relates to activism, because there was no activism in my community growing up. There was charity, but there was no activism because the politics of the synagogue we had like prominent Georgia Republicans as members of our congregation. So the rabbi, who was from New Jersey and grew up totally liberal Democrat, could only preach so much about activism especially like during and around 9/11 when the feeling in the congregation was that like we are with this president and we are with Israel and we are with fighting terror in Iraq and Afghanistan and so yeah, not a lot of liberal not a lot of any sort of activism there except for maybe patriotism, but that's my Jewish. So my Jewish experience actually was completely opposite of yours in that it didn't involve, my activism involved entirely outside of a Jewish context and was totally separate from that.
You made me think of something when you were talking about like here specifically at Addis. Like I'm also a member, and when I moved to DC 18 months ago from Boston, and when I was shul shopping, a colleague of mine said to me, I had mentioned I was living in Cleveland Park, and they were like, "Oh, I used to belong at Addis, but I had to leave. I hated how much political preaching the rabbis were doing from the Bima, and that's just not." And I knew this person's politics, and I said immediately, "That's the right place for me," because I didn't want that experience that you had described of your experience growing up. I wanted them merged. So it's interesting, like it made me think, that's specifically what brought me here.
Well, it's interesting you say that because as of tomorrow, I will officially be a member of Addis Israel. It's very new.
Welcome.
So, I also, I call it synagogue hopping, and, hadn't really figured out what my post-grad Jewish life looks like. I'm very involved in the Hillel on my campus, and I currently intern for Naomi Malka, who's the director of the community mikveh, and she, after seeing one of my speeches that I gave, asked me to be a member here, and I was like, 100%, these are the people, these are the people who are doing the things with the Jewish value and tradition, but still shaking things up, and I knew I had to be here.
So how come none of us are post-movement millennials? We all belong to conservative synagogues. Are we emblematic of our generation, or are we outliers?
I never,
Sorry,
ever,
no,
yeah. Are you genuinely asking?
I am.
You can answer too. You're also a
Yeah,
millennial
you're
member of
also
the
a
synagogue.
I never in a million years ever would have thought I would ever be a member of a synagogue. I mean, when I look at who I was, even just a couple months ago, even a couple years ago, I'm a totally different human in terms of my Judaism, and never, I didn't grow up with this temple. I didn't grow up going to any of these things. My grandmother did, and my grandfather did. So, their Judaism was what I considered the Judaism that I would never be able to attain, and to be here doing that, carrying her her legacy and their legacy is very important to me, and I think it should be emblematic. I think what we are doing is its own form of resistance and activism, even just by being here and by being a part of this community.
That's good.
Yeah.
Did you get that?
Hi, Mom. Just say hi to my grandma. But I think it's really important that we're here, and I think I'm paying next to nothing in terms of membership dues, but the fact that I'm giving in an increment of 18 feels it still makes me tear up a little bit that I'm here, and this is part of who I am and makes up my identity, and to do that the onus of that literally came from activism. I was asked to be a member as I was giving a speech at the Supreme Court, and I mentioned this congregation, and I mentioned how much it meant to me to work with the just totally badass women that I work with. And Naomi was like, I want to put a ring on it. Let's do it. Let's make it official. And I was like, please. So they're totally, those identities are totally constitutive of each other, and they make sense to me.
Well, that might be an interesting segue into what I want to ask next, which is, I'm sure we've all read the doomsday prediction that is the Pew Research Center's Portrait of Jewish America.
I read it today, actually.
And that's even more fascinating considering the introductions that you gave. We have people who grew up in non-Jewish households and half-Jewish households who are now members of synagogues. So in 2017, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, tends to lean a little bit left, describe a sudden uptick in synagogue attendance and membership sales as a Trump bump. Thinking about your own Jewish circles, would you say that there was any sort of a Trump bump in terms of Jewish activism, Jewish practice, people becoming members of synagogues, or do you find that you're a minority within your social circles?
I'm 22, I'm a total minority. Yeah, nobody's thinking about this yet. We don't have to quite yet, so.
I think, November, the Shabbat after, not even the Shabbat after, the day after the election at this congregation was people were just at such, now I should say, liberal, Democratic voting Jews or Hillary Clinton voting Jews were at such a loss for what is this country that we call home? What is this world that we live in? How could this happen? And this was a place that people turned to sort of find some answers to those questions. And I think it's a lot to the credit of the clergy in this community, but I think it's I believe that there was a Trump bump, which I hate putting his name on the front of it. I'd like to think of it as let's just there was at least in that immediate moment, a total feeling of grief, loss, let's have some Shiva and Shloshim, and maybe after a year we can find how we repair the world that is where we can see through the cracks right now, gaping holes, and
I don't know about the Trump bump effect. Like, I don't know what they're like are. It's like really used as like, if did that happen or not. But like to your point, like absolutely. And I think for myself, like not just in the immediate effects after the election, but for myself, like especially with everything that's been going on, like for some people it was what you were doing, and it was like on the front lines, like with the Kavanaugh hearings, it was like you were literally putting your body on the line, and like for other people it was like I can't do that, or I'm in a different space, or whatever it was. And for me it was coming here, like the craziness of the week, the terribleness of the news, and getting stuck into a Twitter hole of just reading horrible thing after horrible thing after horrible. It was having that space, having that break, and having a community. And I think like that is at the heart of all of that, is just having that community to come together. And whether it's sitting Shiva after the election, or if it's being able to say the prayer for your country with others around you who feel the same way.
So I will say I obviously was not a member of any synagogue, but this is reminding me that the day I was my first full semester involved with Hillel on campus as a sophomore, it was Tuesday night was the election. Wednesday I had a meeting with my supervisors, the tzedek intern at Hillel, and Molly had like totally decided to cancel. Molly Cram, different Molly.
Explain who that is.
Oh, she was Molly Cram was my intern supervisor at AU Hillel. Thank you. Different, many Mollys. And she was like, we're not even gonna like come to work, but they opened the Hillel lounge and brought bagels, and literally I remember seeing you walked in, Hannah, and like cried, and I remember just sitting there feeling numb and just surrounded by like, I think it was like 5 or 6 other women who had just like self-selected, like came into the Hillel space. It's an interfaith space, but like we have our own little lounge. And I remember just feeling like something very powerful in that community. It wasn't an official synagogue community, but it was a Jewish community. It was very deeply a Jewish community. And for us to all come and mourn in that way was cathartic in a way, and very important to me.
So, as a Jewish millennial, I find that sometimes we struggle to embrace our great Jewish tradition of bitter argument and
Really?
intense
What are
polarization.
you talking about?
But the same Pew Research study identified about 22% of American Jews as leaning Republican, and especially considering the fact that some ethnic groups who have recently moved to the United States, like Soviet Jews, Persian Jews, even some segments of Israeli society that have moved to the United States might have some more conservative leanings. What duty do we have, if any, in our communities to facilitate some sort of dialogue or to welcome those people into our communities?
I just really quick want to say that 22% voted Republican, 70% voted the other way. The one who should have won. 78? 78. 78.
I mean, my family is that 22%. I mean, like the Thanksgiving after the election, it was like, how do I face these people? We are so polar opposites, because I have like cousins and uncles who were like really happy with the direction this country is going, and like not, and I didn't even want to like talk to them, and but the thing is, like, you have to, because they're your family. I don't know if this answers your question, but like, I'm glad that you bring it up though, because I do have to say that like we clearly represent the 78%, but I have to interact with the 22% every time I go home, and unfortunately there have been a lot of family gatherings in the past year with my family because of certain deaths and marriages and things, but good things and bad things, but and it's just a kind of reality that we live in 2 separate Jewish worlds. Like, we live in the American Jews are as split as Americans, plural, that where my aunts and uncles go to shul, where the JCC they go to, the places they go are like, they love Donald Trump, or I mean, even if they don't love Donald Trump, they think, well, he's moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he's cut our taxes, he's, and the thing that my cousins say to me all the time is, well, what rights has he taken away from you? What, like, you're just buying into a lot of hysteria and hype over that's being brought up, and that's a reality I have to face, and I'm glad that we're representing it here, even if we don't really represent it. And obviously, I haven't really gotten to a place where I can answer these questions of like, what do we do about them? Because talking to them, I think, is a good step, and like sitting down with them at dinner is, and at a wedding is like a step of like connecting because we're family. But when it gets to the issues where we're like so polarized, well, in the South we just don't talk about that.
We have this conversation a lot within Hillel. You know, Hillel is a space on campus for any Jewish student, regardless of their political background, their religious practice. It's supposed to be a pluralistic space that's accepting for, you know, any Jew who wants to, you know, come and find that as a home, and hopefully also open up its doors to anyone else on campus who wants to come in. But at the same time, when most of the students are probably going to be not even the 78%, maybe even a higher percentage, they're young college students. But at the same time, we are doing it. I don't know necessarily how, but like especially when you're talking about Israel, I feel like that number is way higher than 22% sometimes.
Would you describe the kind of conversations that you facilitate to give us a sense of
Yeah. I mean, I think that you kind of described it really well in the diversity within the Jewish community, depending on where you are, especially when it comes to the politics of Israel, especially the embassy move and things like that Trump is viewed very positively for many communities who, if that's their number one issue or one of the most important issues to them as an American Jew or a Jew in America, then it's all good. You know, if you're a one issue voter, or if that's you know, what you hold most dear as like a Jewish American. We have students who, you know, that they might not agree with 90% of what's happening, you know, in the administration, but for them, you know, all's good, you know, when it looks on Israel, and so that's okay. And so we do have a space where students are coming together. It's not perfect and it's not easy and it's not fun, but there are times and places where students are able to do that. Specifically for us, for my job, we have teams of students, mostly Jewish students who are involved in Hillel who care about Israel, and they come from all different backgrounds. We have students who are Israeli, we have students whose parents are immigrants, we have students who, you know, their great-great-great-grandparents were the ones who were immigrants from, you know, conservative, reform, no affiliated backgrounds. We have, you know, students who are left-wing, right-wing, students who care about Israel but don't care about the politics, and somehow we can put them in a room and get them to talk. And what's most important is that you're not actually talking politics, you're like talking about what you care about, what you feel, you're sharing your own thoughts, and you're able to create that space where students can have that conversation. We're doing it just in the context of Israel, so it gets a little harder then when you bring it to the Thanksgiving table, and you know, I've tried that myself with my, you know, right-leaning family, and it doesn't always work, but you know, it's an approach.
To be honest, I don't really have these conversations. I go to a school that is very far one political direction, and there's often this derision when people hear that of like, oh, you go to the liberal bubble, like you are, you know, in your bubble, like you're in your echo chamber. And I think there's merits to it. That is probably an unpopular opinion to say that, but I've been able to hone my voice and hone my political voice, so when I do encounter people who very deeply feel the other way, I know I'm confident in my own story, my own narrative, and my own thoughts, and I'm able to better translate that and better have that, you know, have those conversations and those tough conversations. But I think it becomes more complicated if the opposite was true. Like if I was constantly being bombarded, and as a liberal, like if I was a liberal in the South, like I think my story would look a lot different. And I'm very grateful to be in the very far left groups that I'm in, because it's given me a lot of tools and a lot of vocabulary and a lot of ways to think about things that I'm confident in. And when I do encounter people who are very far the other way, I'm better equipped to have, you know, to have conversations about human rights and social justice and what that looks like.
You're really good at segueing into what I want to ask.
That's what I'm here for. You planted me.
So, a lot of American Jews who grew up in Zionist households or have some Zionist beliefs, of course the Zionist beliefs differ from person to person, feel uncomfortable in activist circles because in some activist circles that's not a welcome belief or affiliation. Do you think that there's room for this kind of diversity in activist circles? And what do you think the future of these circles look like?
I can take this one, yeah. As somebody,
You don't all
yeah.
have to answer every question. Feel free.
There, it's no secret that like Zionism is very heavily. What is one word I could even use to describe what Zionism is like on campus? It's very hated. Very, like, the concept of Zionism is so conflated with anti-Semitism. I mean, I could talk about this forever. And as somebody who is very deeply a Zionist and also very, very progressive, I find that I'm always at odds with those two identities and always struggle to find places for those two identities to coexist in ways that feel comfortable and authentic to me. There's so many far left, that aren't explicitly far left, but very progressive, idealistic organizations on campus that I've been told as a Zionist I'm not allowed in. I often find that I have to, and the same goes for Jewish spaces. There are Jewish spaces where I'm told that I'm too progressive to be in. So I struggle with, I'm too progressive for some Jewish Zionist spaces, and I'm too Jewish and Zionist for some progressive spaces. And finding that tension and like holding that is very challenging for me because I believe what I believe very deeply, and I don't ever want to compromise my identities. And how dare anyone make me, right? Are we living in an age where like aren't we supposed to be able to celebrate all of who we are proudly and excitedly? And I'm still being told that I'm too much of one thing and not enough of another, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I get this pushback from both sides saying that I should be less of these things. And what I started to do is say, like, I am a Zionist, I'm a Jew, I'm a feminist, and I'm an activist. How are you going to hold these identities? I'm comfortable with myself. I'm very comfortable with these identities. I know who I am. I know what I believe in, and I know what I fight for. How are you going to come to terms with that? And a lot of times people get very freaked out by that. They're like, oh, I don't know. Like, because I have my activist resume. Like, I have my track record. I have my Jewish resume and my Jewish track record. And I show those things, and it's not up to me to convince anyone else. I'm going to keep doing my thing. Like, I'm going to keep doing my own Zionist activist thing. And if people have issues, they have issues. I can't change how they feel. I can just be me as exuberantly and loudly as I can be and hope for the best. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting with this question is the challenge you described, and on the other side of that, there are communities, there are spaces where Jews and especially Jewish Zionists are very welcome, and I think where I see what is the difference, why is that possible, is just a total misunderstanding around Jewish peoplehood, and everything that comes with that, especially around Israel, that if you are the average American, you only know Judaism through the lens of religion, and you can't necessarily think of a peoplehood associated with a religion. And so when you view Israel, you only then are viewing it through the lens of religion. And if you're only doing that, it's easy in these progressive and left groups to view it negatively and see challenges or see things that, if you read it and you're only viewing it through the lens of religion, it might not seem right. But if you understand Jewish peoplehood and you understand Zionism as a movement of self-determination and there's an actual connection to this historical land, then in some of these communities and some of these progressive leaders can then understand how Zionism or how Jews can have a space in these progressive movements, because at the core there's the same principles, the same values guiding both, and so that is where I see a huge struggle in the U.S. with not just having a Jewish space in these progressive movements, but also for the understanding of Israel and what will millennial views and thoughts and opinions on Israel be in 15, 20 years, and I think that a lot of that comes down to this peoplehood question of how how are we explaining ourselves, and how are others viewing us and therefore associating Israel with us? Because we see a lot of times, and we're seeing right now what's happening in England with the Labour Party, it is the association of like Jew, therefore Zionist, therefore Israel, therefore bad. And we see that in a lot of these progressive movements.
I mean, I almost want to. I mostly want to. I buy you. I'm getting this, but I think a bigger issue though is Jews being perceived as like white colonialists, white colonizers, and so I more think that the issue is not recognizing Jewish peoplehood as the diversity of Jewish peoplehood, that like, which is partly because of this country. It's like I come from a Sephardic background or Mizrahi background, and Mexican Jews, and who all like in the South of the United States of America tried to be as white as possible because of the circumstances that they lived in. So they belonged to Ashkenazi synagogues because, first of all, and they were Ashkenormative, and they were trying to be white because that was safety.
Mm-hmm.
So that has put the pressure on Jews as a people in the United States of America to try to assimilate and become as white as possible. And that, I think, is what we're struggling with on the left, is this perception that Jews are white colonial, like Ashkenazi.
Absolutely. And I think that I completely agree. If you don't understand peoplehood in a true way, it's really easy to view Israel as, white European Jews colonizing another land. And then therefore all of those other, and then because of that, and if you even remotely think that you support Israel, then like you definitely don't have a place in our LGBT club or women's rights movement or at the Black Lives Matter march.
And I think you touched on something really important too, in this idea of assimilation. And I feel like I am fighting assimilation. And what does it mean to claim an identity that marginalizes you? And what does that look like? And especially what does that look like in progressive circles when there is lots of reclamation of marginalized identities and celebration of marginalized identities? And it's really messy. It's like messy discourse, and it's very heated, and there's lots of territory that you have to navigate to not step on, and it's challenging. None of it is easy, but I think it goes to this idea of like internal Jewish activism and external Jewish activism. So like activism within the Jewish community of saying like, no, I am going to claim these identities. I am going to say like, it's not about being a white colonizer, right? Like, what is my actual identity, and doing that like radical reclamation of these identities. And then there's like all the external, like being Jewish as an activist externally. But I think that internal part is really important for us to do.
Can I follow up a little bit? I think
Yeah.
you bring up a very interesting point, in that the way that Judaism has been practiced in the West, with Reform Judaism stemming from Germany in the late 19th century, to how, at least visually, aesthetically, American Judaism has almost become more traditional in all three movements over the past few decades. Why do you think that is, and why is that such an important part of your Jewish identity and your activism?
So, I grew up with no Judaism, really. And I only had my grandparents' Judaism, which was conservative Judaism. So I also, when I say I didn't ever think I would wind up at a synagogue, I also never, ever thought I would wind up at a conservative synagogue. So I really have no way of answering that question, because it's all new to me. And I genuinely when I did imagine, I always thought I would end up Reform, because I had this idea that Reform meant politically left and liberal and all these things, and more progressive in certain ways. And Addis has very clearly shown that to be wrong, that you can more authentically practice halakha and this like Jewish way of life authentically and be progressive in those ways. So I don't know how to answer that.
That's a good answer.
Can I go? Mm-hmm. I think it is because of this is like so controversial. I can't believe it's being recorded.
Internal use only.
Well,
I'll just say it. I'm gonna be inspired by you to like claim my statements and be impolite. I think it's because a lot of they recognize hypocrisy in American Judaism, and I think that's the movement towards a little more traditional. Is that we're looking at I'm looking at the practice that my parents have, and going to different shuls and seeing like where there is like the layers of hypocrisy of like okay, you say this mitzvah, like these are mitzvot, but you don't follow them, but like you follow these ones and not these ones, and it's about
the tension between like reform and conservative.
the tension between like even within the conservative movement, though, I think there's this feeling of like you like you say you are like this much Jewish, but then like you're actually cheating. Like, you know, you're like going to synagogue in the morning and then getting like a bacon cheeseburger for lunch afterwards. Like
it's arbitrary.
That like level of, that's what I mean by hypocrisy. I just threw out the word hypocrisy.
The idea that the conservative movement as an establishment views halakha as valid, but the majority of its congregants view it as tradition as opposed to religious law.
Thank you. That's a better way to explain it. And so that's where I think, and I also think that the millennial generation, like as our parents did to their parents, and as their parents did to their parents, in every generation, we look at what our once we reach adulthood, and we like have the choice, which is what I think like converts I love talking to, because I inherited a practice of Judaism that was like how my family did it, and I guess what I realized when I'm talking to a friend, like I got to a moment where I was an adult where I guess I had the choice, like, right, you're like an adult, you live in your own house, like, do you keep kosher? Do you like, are you gonna keep Shabbos? Are you going to like how Jewish are you going to be? And it's, I think, easy for me to slip into the tradition, like the way that I grew up, and I feel more comfortable in the way that I grew up. And I love like my friends who've converted, who got to like make a choice in their life to be, and I've had friends who grew up Reform and have like gone totally like Aliyah, like Orthodox, like super religious, and then friends the other way who grew up Orthodox and are now like didn't go to Yom Kippur. So it's about, I think in every generation, like finding that definition, and I think that our generation is sort of trying to say like, these are our beliefs, and so we're going to follow them.
So I'm gonna ask one more question,
Great.
and then I'm sure that our audience has some questions for you as well. So we talked about the fact that Addis is uniquely progressive, perhaps not uniquely, but it is progressive, that there are some congregations that lean a little bit more conservative, like the one in which you grew up. What does the future of a successful American Judaism look like? Does it engage people politically? Are there diverse congregations where some do and some don't? Or do you think that a successful, vibrant American Judaism has rabbis speaking politically at the pulpit?
I mean, you're going to have diversity in whatever success will look like, and I think that what draws a lot of people in, and especially like, you know, what is pulling in younger people into, you know, not, you know, your earlier question of like, you know, synagogue membership going up, like younger people who are joining a synagogue, they're self-selecting into a community. If you're looking for a political community, you're going to self-select into that. If you're not, you're going to find one that isn't. I think that the political engagement part won't necessarily indicate what is the future of, you know, people joining, you know, is the millennial generation ever, you know, going to have membership in 50 years? Are our kids? I don't know if the political part will really be a part of that, but I think like for me, in choosing like this congregation specifically, it was like that I felt like that all of my identities were very welcomed, that like that there were young people, there were older people, there were people that were kind of on all spectrums of observance. There were, you know, there's a very present and vibrant queer community, that there are a lot of converts, that like this is for me a place that I can have all of my identities. And I think for a lot of millennials it's about community and being all of those identities at once.
Well, I think to that degree, I do fully believe that the personal is political. We cannot separate our personal identities from the political landscape in which we live. and all of our identities need to be fully celebrated. I'm not going to closet one part of myself to make some people feel better. And congregations are going to really have to grapple with what that looks like and really understand what that means to be a fully supportive and fully open community. And if they don't want to be, they have to they're gonna have to deal with the consequences of that, of like potentially lower membership, people not wanting to engage, all of these things. And I think that is one reason why I'm so drawn to Addis, is that like I come from like the background I come from, like it's almost like a non-issue, and I found all these ways where I can push my identities and grow my identities within this Jewish space. And I hope Addis becomes a model for other Jewish spaces like that as well.
I mean, what you said earlier is like a perfect example of a model. Like, she was asked to join. Like,
yeah. I
invite people in.
Yeah.
Invite them in.
Yeah.
Don't wait for them to come to you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I ever would have asked had I not been asked myself.
Yeah.
I was like, top 5 moments of my life was like being asked to join synagogue. So
I think that millennial philanthropy is a perfect example of a future, or like points to what the future of synagogue, of American Judaism and what like communities could be, and that is that millennials like to give where there's the most impact. And so if your community, your Jewish organization is not making some kind of measurable impact, then you're not going to get a lot of millennial support. And so the fact that this community has such a strong, whether that's so, why I'm going to say that and frame it from that impact language is because then it's not about politics so much. So like the synagogue I grew up in, like whether that impact is in their local community, like serving the needy, or in a political context, like maybe we have more here with like rabbis out protesting, that's I think where millennials are gonna feel like their religion should not just be a place where they go and like talk to God, but a place where like they actually see the world around them changing through their community.
Millennials have like $4 collectively. We'd like to see them being used like in a good way. Like, yeah. So,
Especially
especially here, high cost of living. So, yeah.
Great. Well, we'll end it on that macabre note. Thank you so much.
Should we say something really cheesy, like quote Pirkei Avot real quick? Like, Tikkun Olam.
Well, before we get to your questions, and I'm very excited to hear them, I just wanted to point out that we brought some print resources. They're on this table that you should take a look at afterwards.